thank everyone for being here and welcome everyone. It's really lovely to have you with us virtually. It would have been very different, I know, but at least this way our reach can be extended. So thank you for our first in a new semester of research seminars. This series is hosted by the English department at Maynooth University. My name is Catherine Ganda. I'm Associate Professor of American Literature here in the English department. And this is a special research seminar series on the subject of humanities and human rights. And it's run in conjunction with the research hub CRISES, which is critical research into states, ecologies and societies. And this session will last approximately an hour. So a few housekeeping things before we start. We're using Microsoft Teams. It has a similar functionality to Zoom, and I use the word loosely. We would ask you to keep your microphones muted throughout the talk, and please feel free to unmute in order to show your appreciation through applause after the talk, because it is still very nice to hear a round of applause once you finish delivering your research. But please do remember that it is important to keep your mics muted whilst the talk is in progress, and your microphone and your cameras off as well. After the talk, there will be a Q&A session. If you have a question, would you please write that question in the chat, and I will present it to Dr. King. There may be some spoken questions from the floor. If there are, they will likely be from our English department, my colleagues in the English department who are hosting this event. To access the chat and to mute your microphone or to unmute, you'll see a ribbon of icons at the bottom of your screen when you move the cursor. I think most of you are very familiar with Teams by now, but if you're not, if you just move the cursor, you'll see a little ribbon of icons and you can choose between those. This session is being recorded. Okay, thank you very much. We are absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Nicole King to begin the seminar series and to contribute to the events planned by the university for Black History and Black Futures Month. Dr. King lectures in the Department of English and Comparative Studies at Goldsmiths University of London. She was appointed by Goldsmiths in 2017, having previously been lecturer in American and Caribbean literature at the University of Reading, visiting lecturer at Brunel University, associate professor of African American and Caribbean literature at the University of California, San Diego, assistant professor of African American and Caribbean literature at the University of Maryland. Dr. King's current research is concerned with the literary representations of children, young adults, Blackness and modernity in the United States and the Americas. She also writes about the literature of the Caribbean diaspora, and on Black British literature. She has published articles and book chapters on C.L.R. James, Attica Locke, Zadie Smith, Andrew Lee, Toni Morrison, Earl Lovelace, and Ida B. Wells. Pedagogical theory and how literature is taught is an additional research interest for Dr. King, which developed during her time at the English Subject Centre at Royal Holloway between 2006 and 2011, and the Higher Education Academy at York 2011 to 2014. She regularly presents on teaching topics and has contributed an essay on teaching African American crime fiction to Teaching 21st Century Genres, published by Palgrave in 2016, and an essay on teaching African American literature and critical thinking to Teaching Literature, published Palgrave 2017. Her first book, C.L.R. James and Creolization, Circles of Influence, was published in 2001 to critical acclaim, and her current book project, Black Childhood in Modern African American Fiction, which is in progress for Edinburgh University Press, offers a comparative historical analysis of racialization and young people in novels and short stories from the 20th century, mid-20th century onwards. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Nicole King, who will talk to us today about two wonderful characters, Selena and Birdie. from two great 20th century novels. The title of her research talk is War and the Destabilising Effect of Black Girlhood in Paule Marshall's Brown Girl, Brownstones and Danzy Senna's Caucasia. So Nicole, I am going to mute myself and hand over.
Okay, before you mute yourself, thank you for that fantastic introduction. It's great to see everybody's little thumbnail prints. I just want to figure out what we do next. So you're going to mute, and I'm just going to go to slideshow because you can see my screen right now.
We can see your camera, so you'll need to share your screen with the open share tray.
Okay, so can you see that right now?
I can see your face. I can see what your camera can see.
Okay. All righty. Give me a second, everyone.
Not a problem.
Here we go. And then I'm going to minimize you, Catherine. We'll go to slideshow. And away we go.
Thank you.
So yes, many thanks to Catherine and to Maynooth University. It's an honor to help launch this series of research talks, and I feel like I'm in amazing company. I'm looking forward to the subsequent talks later in the year. And it's also really a welcome opportunity for me to share with you some of my work in progress. I'm just setting a little timer here for myself. Okay, it's difficult to conceive of African American literature in the 20th century or in the 19th century without calling to mind its children and its young people. I'm thinking in the 19th century of characters like the young enslaved Frederick Douglass tricking white boys on the Maryland docks to teach them how to read, or the young Harriet Jacobs evading her enslaver's aggressive sexual advances. I'm also thinking of Zora Neale Hurston's teenage Janie Crawford and her horror at the limited life that her grandmother envisions for her. And I'm also thinking of one of my favorites, Gwendolyn Brooks's Maud Martha, who we first meet in that novel at the age of 7. This is a 1953 novel. And Maud Martha likes candy buttons and books and painted music, deep blue and delicate silver, and the west sky, so altering, viewed from the steps of the back porch, and dandelions, yellow jewels for every day, studying the patched green dress of her backyard. Maud Martha, like so many Black girls and children in more generally, evade notice in their ordinariness, their kidness. They are overlooked as specific vehicles of power and agency. And when they are noticed or seen, it is often as part of a collective, a communal, a group that is not highly valued. But when we look at the world through their eyes, we see jewels. And so part of what I'd like to do today is to invite you to look carefully at Black girlhood and at two girls in particular for the next 35 to 40 minutes or so. So it is my contention that when we look at 20th century African American literary representations of Black childhood, complex racial identities are made visible. The elasticity of Black racial identity and the way in which Blackness is simultaneously shaped by gender, geography, class, and sexuality is supremely apparent within the characterizations of children and young people. So my talk today makes the argument for reading Brown Girl, Brownstones and Caucasia as novels which share a commitment to such complex representations of Black girlhood. I'm going to examine how in these two texts, one written at the midpoint and the other at the end point of the 20th century, Black girlhood functions as a destabilizing force within adult world conflicts, and how Black girls question the structures of the world they inhabit. Theories of childhood, racialization, and feminism help me to assert that these texts accomplish two representational feats. They center Black girlhood in narratives of US identities, and they capture the agency of children, girls in particular, actively shaping their worlds before their own adulthood arrives. Before I go any further, let me give you an overview of these two texts in case, this is so strange to be doing a presentation like this. I'd usually ask for a show of hands, but God forbid I try to get out of the PowerPoint and go back to the Teams screen. But so I have no idea how many of you are familiar with these texts or not. So I'm going to just give you a little précis of each in case you're not familiar with them. And I should also say that individually a great deal has been written about both of these texts, but I think, and I'm happy to be corrected here, I think I'm the first person to place these two texts into conversation with one another. So first, Caucasia by Danzy Senna. Caucasia is a first-person narrative about a mixed-race Black girl, Birdie Lee, whose family in the early 1970s makes this decision to split up. The parents make this decision. Birdie and her sister Cole each go with the parent who they most resemble. Sandy, the mother, who is white, is wanted for her involvement in a never-named radical Black Power underground group, and she takes Birdie because Birdie can pass for a white girl, and they expect this will stump the police, who would be looking for a white woman and her Black daughter. Their Black father, a professor of race, takes Birdie's sister Cole, who is, quote, cinnamon-skinned and more obviously Black in her appearance. There is a ton of references, and there are several articles about this, to hair in the text. I'm not going to be talking about hair, but hair is a way of thinking through the spectrum of racial identity for Danzy Senna. So Cole goes with their father, and they depart America for the perceived racial haven of Brazil. And the narrative spans Birdie's life from about 8 to about 16. And I think it's really important, one of the most important things in terms of the rest of my talk, is to note that Birdie understands herself as Black, even though phenotypically she does not always present as Black to people around her, people who are perceiving her. And I just have here on the screen a list of some of Danzy Senna's other books. She's short stories, novels, and a memoir. So Brown Girl, Brownstones by the amazing and now late Paule Marshall tells the story of Selena Boyce, the daughter of Barbadian immigrants to Brooklyn, New York, and we see Selena growing up in the 1930s and the 1940s. This novel chronicles her negotiation of family, community, and, like Birdie, also puberty, growing into adulthood. Her mother, referred to unaffectionately in the text as the mother, is called Scylla, and Selena's father, Dayton, come to represent very different approaches to life in America, with the mother striving to access the American dream via whatever jobs are available to her as a Black woman in mid-century. Hers is a ruthless pursuit of property acquisition. I'm not going to say too much more in case you are inspired to go read this text, but it is ruthless, and that is the property that is so desirable to Scylla and to her generation are the brownstones of which are like sort of grand townhouses. You will see a depiction of them in the cover, or on the cover, which is in the link to the talk. Anyway, Selena's father also works, but he fails to move forward, and the text implies this is because he does not have the drive that Scylla does, but also he occupies a different approach to life, which is at times artistic, playful, his wife would say, immature. Their incompatibility as a couple is one of the major battlegrounds of the text. War is in my title for this talk, and we see Selena sort of transform from the age of 10 to about the age of 20. So these brief overviews of each text, and I'll fill in more gaps as I go along, give you a sense of the battlegrounds which feature in Birdie and Selena's girlhoods. There are the literal battlegrounds of World War II. At one point, the mother works in a, I think it's a munitions factory in the outskirts, on the outskirts of Brooklyn. So they're the literal battlegrounds and war contexts of World War II, but also of the Black Power movement, which are the backdrop to the combative domestic spheres of these families. There is also the struggle to survive in a racist, capitalist, sexist series of environments within the United States, which each of these two girls witness. And they also see how their parents sometimes accommodate those systems of oppression in order to survive. There are also, as I've alluded to, the domestic wars of each family, which include battles, quite vociferous battles between the parents, and the fact that both Birdie and Selena at different moments are forced, or their parents try to force them to choose sides. I do want to say this, that neither text places a very high value on heteronormativity or traditional marriages, which is, I think, really, really interesting, not especially for the 1959 text for Brown Girl. Ultimately, both Birdie and Selena refuse binary parental allegiances, and using weapons of their own making, they destabilize and reject the war worlds of their parents. The texts show how they assert or begin to construct alternative empowered spaces for themselves, which are not predicated just on growing up, but rather requires that they actually take their childhood with them. And so this is one of the ways, which I'll circle back to, that I feel these texts, or I see these texts valuing childhood as childhood. But that idea of how they take their childhood with them, I will specifically circle back to at the end of my paper. Because I'm sure you're wondering, well, how is that possible? One of them is 20 by the time the text finishes, and the other is 16. Within the domestic spheres in which they exist, the protagonists and even less central girl characters develop weapons and land blows which destabilize the authority of their adults, who would rather that the girls acquiesce to the parental program of expectations. In other words, both texts mobilize Black girlhoods, and specifically Black girls, as destabilizing forces in the battles initiated by their adults. Caucasia, if you are familiar with this text, you'll know this. has been discussed extensively as a modern day passing novel. And I think some of the best scholarship on the book is by Relina Joseph in her 2013 monograph, Transcending Blackness from the New Millennium, a mulatta to the exceptional multiracial. And I'm really going to avoid, or not going to discuss in any depth, that aspect of the text today. I'm going to be talking about race and racialization, but not the specifics of the passing novel. But I did want to say that it is a feature that makes this a great text to teach, not least because of the way in which one might pair it with earlier 20th century passing novels, such as those by Nilla Larsen. The other key thing, which I will be talking about today, is that it makes it, the passing narrative makes it impossible not to address whiteness in conversations about racialization and racism. Caucasia shows how both whiteness and blackness are socially constructed, and also makes quite explicit the intimate and cultural values of types of whiteness and types of blackness. The text is at pains, for instance, to distinguish between white Jewish identity and white Anglo-Saxon Protestant identities, wealthy whiteness, and trailer park whiteness, and above all, white liberal whiteness. Birdie does not just pass for white, she passes for Jewish as well, which means that within particular white contexts that she finds herself in, that she and her mother find themselves in, she is still othered, which makes for very interesting sorts of conundra and also class discussions. In its depiction of the spectrum of whiteness and blackness, Caucasia shares with Brown Girl, Brownstones the idea of racial identity as a, quote, complex of social meanings constantly being transformed by political conflict. And that's a quote from Howard Winant. And so Winant's notion of racialization is one that I'm going to talk about in a second. Brown Girl, Brownstones depicts and differentiates between US blackness and Barbadian blackness. But here again, Selena eventually refuses that binary formula. So when I use the term racialization, or when I've used it prior to this moment and throughout this paper, I'm drawing on Winant and also the work that he's done with Michael Omi in terms of racial formation, which understands race in US context as, and this is the current slide, a fluid, unstable, and decentered complex of social meanings. Race both shapes the individual psyche and quote-unquote colors relationships among individuals on the one hand, and furnishes an irreducible component of collective identities and social structures on the other. What I really like about Omi and Winant is the way in which they help us to think through, and of course Stuart Hall does this, lots of people, David Theo Goldberg, but very, very accessible ways of thinking about the paradox, what Fanon has identified as that racial paradox, or the paradox of race. These definitions from Winant help account for the social meanings of race that both Birdie and Selena, who understand themselves as types or a type of young Black girl, how they confront and learn to negotiate. In each of their experiences, racial meanings and significations are transformed by political conflict within their homes and within their communities. Such racialized political conflict shapes their girlhoods. I'd like to now turn to some examples from each text and suggest how Birdie and Selena become aware of types of Blackness, the types of Blackness they are meant to inhabit according to their families, according to friends, and according to strangers. Equally, they become aware of types of femininity they are meant to inhabit. There are, I'm not going to have time to talk about this, but there are very finely rendered scenes in each book, and multiple scenes of each girl being inducted into very particular ways of displaying their girlness, right, and ways in which they are, it's suggested that they're not quite the right type of girl. So they become aware of types of femininity they are meant to inhabit, and they become aware of the privileges of whiteness and how it can be weaponized. They also become aware of how relative wealth, poverty, and perceptions of class positioning affect how they are read as raced and gendered young people. So I do think this might come up in the Q&A. I mean, we think about all of these issues on a regular basis within studies of contemporary literature, certainly African American literature. But I don't think we pay as much attention to how these this sort of awareness of social systems that children are inculcated into these social systems from a very, very young age. So Selena and Birdie's understandings do not come all at once, and the girls are not always strategically prepared for them, if ever. But the texts, I argue, frame key moments of understanding as destabilizing moments enacted through a formulation of powerful Black girlhood. So I'd like to start with this example from Caucasia. In Caucasia, Birdie and her mother, Sandy, escaped the authorities by disappearing into a world of whiteness. And for the longest period of their life, on the run, as it were, they present themselves as the widow, Sheila Goldman, and her half-Jewish daughter, Jessie Goldman. They fabricate a dead Jewish father, who also conveniently helps to explain Birdie / Jessie's tendency to tan in the sun. This is a very standard trope in a passing narrative. Anyway, Birdie goes along with all of her mother's ideas for the most part because she believes it will lead to a safe reunion with her father, and especially with her beloved sister Cole. The text is adept at balancing its discourse of race as unstable with its portrayal of how Birdie and Cole in their old life together, which takes up a good third or so of the novel, are nurtured, how they are nurtured within a politicized, heterogeneous understanding of themselves as Black that supersedes any phenotypical difference between the sisters. They bond over their Blackness, and so the loss of Cole and the loss of the context in which she presents herself to the world as Black leaves Birdie as Jessie particularly vulnerable to the appearance of another mixed race Black girl in New Hampshire, and specifically in a New Hampshire all-white other milieu. And so this girl's called Samantha Taper. Samantha Taper's visible Blackness is in an otherwise all-white community vulnerable to racism and loneliness that Birdie sidesteps to a large extent, bypassing for white. The appearance of Samantha Taper, whom the text describes in detail, first disrupts life for Birdie, setting in train a series of events which conclude with Birdie really shifting her sense of her mother and considering her mother a betrayer who withheld information that might have helped find Cole and her father. Samantha Taper is, in Birdie's eyes, her sister Cole's doppelganger. So Birdie observes, "The girl was black like me, half, that is. I could spot another one immediately, but her blackness was visible, deep-set eyes, caramel complexion. She looked tired, with dark bruises of exhaustion around her eyes. Her features were a jumble of tribes and unplanned unions. She must have felt my gaze on her because she looked down at me abruptly, meeting my eyes." And as I was rereading this in preparation for today, I realized I just wanted to say that she's looking down at Birdie because she's in a bus and Birdie is on the curb on the pavement after school. So Birdie's looking up at her, and Samantha catches her eye. Oops, I've jumped forward here. Amidst racist abuse that Birdie's friend Mona heaps on Samantha when describing her, more parallels with Cole emerge. Samantha is smart and confident enough to try out for and win a spot on the coveted baton squad of the majorette team. This is an America I have no familiarity with, but she's a baton twirler. And significantly, given the racist white working class milieu of the school, which Senna describes in great detail, Samantha carries her baton with her at all times, quote, "a silver rod decorated with red, white, and blue tape, like a weapon." We can read the symbolism of the red, white, and blue baton as a nod to the way in which blackness is integral to Americanness, and this black girl is integral. She has a very important role on this coveted school team. Samantha, unlike Birdie, does her best to assert her right to exist as a black girl, to take up space, and becomes a touchstone for Birdie, who will subsequently use Samantha Taper's very existence, the fact of her blackness, to quote Fanon again, to force her mother into an understanding of the catastrophe of having separated Birdie and her sister Cole. For those of you who know the text, this moment comes at a midpoint of the novel, in a very mundane setting of supermarket shopping, and the sort of moment where Samantha, as it were, appears before Birdie's mother. And the moment is interpolated through the bodies of three young people: Samantha, Birdie as Jessie, and the absent Cole. And these bodies exist. The text tells us in very fine detail how they exist along a color spectrum, an age spectrum, a gender spectrum, and a class spectrum. But the text asks us to, I just got a message, we've got so much technology going, saying that you can't see my slides. So that's okay, because I'm not, let me just advance. Can you see? I wonder if you can see that one. Minimize that.
That's perfect. Thanks, Nicole. Sorry about that.
No problem. It's just amazing. It's just amazing. So I'm not quite ready for that slide. We're still on the Black Like Me slide. Okay, where was I? Interpolation by these three black girls: Samantha, Cole in absentia, and Birdie. And I think the text really asks us to consider them and their power as black girls. Their subjectivity orchestrates this turning point in the novel. And the turning point is Birdie really no longer, and it has built up. It's not sudden, but Birdie really no longer being in sync with her mother in this grand adventure. She really begins to have a critical, not infallible, definitely not entirely mature, but absolutely a critical perspective on what is happening to her and what her mother is doing as an adult. The text, this must be said and said emphatically, moves on from this particular moment, the supermarket vision. Sandy basically, the mother, in seeing Samantha Taper, just sees her daughter. She sees Cole in this young woman. That's why I use the word doppelganger. And she almost completely she does blow their cover. She turns to Bertie in sort of disbelief, not saying, "Is this Cole?" but just saying, "Did you know that this young woman existed in our community?" And she calls Bertie. She does not call, and there are a lot of people around for whom that seems nonsensical. But this is what I wanted to say about what happens after this moment, which is the text also insists that we reflect, we as a reader, upon the insidious and regular anti-Black racism which Bertie participates in. Okay. And that's the whole nother section of the text, but it leads on from this particular moment. So it's another sort of a turning point. It asks us to consider white mothers of phenotypically Black girls and Black girls who could pass believably as Jessie Goldman's, but above all, the point I want to make here is that it insists on making Black girls visible, especially where they are especially where they are unwelcome and might be safer if unseen. So this supermarket scene, which relies upon Bertie, it relies upon Samantha, and it relies upon the absent Cole. It is about seeing. It is about these Black girls being seen. So that's my point. Sorry if I'm getting over enthusiastic. Okay, so that's the first example, and I just want to check my time and very quickly move on to my second example from Girl Brownstones. So in my reading of Samantha Taper, I was struck by Caucasia marshals a host of very different Black girls to move the narrative along. From start to finish, in many ways, Bertie, the protagonist, is not necessarily the most important Black girl in the text. And similarly, in Brown Girl Brownstones, Selena is but one example of Black girlhood that the text engages with. I'm just going to take a little water. Much of the scholarship on this novel focuses on, as you might imagine, on the mother-daughter relationship. And really that's where we see children in African American literature most regularly. It was in those parental relationships, the dyad of mothers and daughters, mothers and sons, fathers and sons, fathers and daughters. The antagonism between the forceful mother Scylla and her American-born puzzle of a daughter, Selena, the war, the multi-front war of World War II in the background, and the domestic conflict at home. All of this sort of destabilizes Selena's family and community. The most heated front of Selena's war is with her mother. But the text does this really interesting thing. I mean, really, well, for me, it's interesting. I'm hoping to convince you to pick these books up or to pick them up again if you haven't looked at them for a long time. It provides a pivotal moment through which to consider the antagonism between Selena and her mother. And it is actually a moment where Selena and Scylla are juxtaposed as 10-year-old girls. So So I'm going to come on to that quotation in a moment. Strong evidence of lives lived fully by children is on view when Scylla tries to convince Selena that there is nothing nice, quote unquote, nice about growing up in Barbados when she did. And this is in response to an assertion from Selena as a 10-year-old saying she thinks she would like to live there as opposed to living in Brooklyn. This desire to live in Barbados is planted in Selena by her father, who tells her of all of the fun he had as a boy growing up there. So Selena is faced with these, or is presented with these contrasting visions. Whilst Dayton, her dad, swam in the sea with improvised equipment, Scylla worked in sugarcane fields, managed and run like slave plantations, and sold mangoes on the side when she could. So, you know, we're talking about the early 20th century, the early decades of the 20th century. So I'm just going to go to this quote. Selena listened. So this is her mother. For always the mother's voice was a net flung wide, ensnaring all within its reach. She swayed helpless now within its hold, loving its rich color, loving and hating the pain of her childhood. The image of her father swaggering through town as a boy and bounding on the waves in some rough game slanted across that of the small girl hurrying from the dawn ghosts with the basket on her head. It seemed to Selena that her father carried those gay days in his irresponsible smile, while the mother's formidable aspect was the culmination of all that she had suffered. This was no more than an impression, quickly lost in the haze of impressions. That was her mind at 10. But it was there, fixed forever. That the impression was fixed forever in Selena's mind is borne out by the text itself and Selena's eventual reverse migration away from the seeming wasteland of post-war Brooklyn. But to stay with this particular passage for a moment, Scylla is recalling a time when she was about 10 years old and is telling this to her own 10-year-old child. These are memories of childhood being told to a child and which provide the listening child with alternate views of what childhood can be and literally what it was. As both parents participate, the novel calls attention to this, to a triangulated discourse on childhood, but also accounts for how it might be interpreted by a child. In other words, the narrative is very aware of and values the child's consciousness, and the narrative is concerned, centrally concerned, with the representation of Black childhoods, as is evident from these contrasting and lingering descriptions. And these descriptions, I mean, this is early in the text, page 46. But they are referred to over and over. Finally, these exchanges impact the action of this particular exchange, impact the action of the text. At the end of the novel, Selena acts upon the seemingly casual comment she makes to Scylla at age 10 about going back to the Caribbean. So in this text, there is a way in which childhood, inclusive of Black girlhood, literally shapes adulthood. Okay, so this moment, and this I meant to say this text is just over 300 pages, and Caucasia is just over 400 pages, which may make it less desirable to teach. But there's a lot that happens after this. But this is a pivotal moment. Like Caucasia, Brownstones consistently asks us to understand how characters experience childhood, and it emphatically values childhood. It asks us to see these characters through the prism of their childhood selves. Marshall uses the childhoods of Scylla and Dayton to offer dimensionality to the characters as individuals, literally as a way to help the reader and Selena to understand them better. But these childhoods also suggest the heterogeneity within the group identity. Barbadian childhood, right? You know, you may never have thought of this before this moment, but you cannot read Brown Girl, Brownstones and think that it is a singular thing. A focus on the divergent experiences of childhood makes it impossible to view Barbadians, Black women, Black girls, Black boys, Black people in general as a singular mass. Toni Morrison will pick up on this and use childhood similarly in many of her books, beginning with The Bluest Eye in 1970 and Sula in 1974. There's a wonderful line in Sula, we was girls together. It really, that's a text. Anyway, I digress. I'm almost done. Sorry, I just lost my place. Marshall does not suggest individualism and community are incompatible. Rather, she paints a portrait of complex identities, challenging us to consider the implications of heterogeneous Blackness by understanding heterogeneous Black childhoods. Central to this talk is taken from a chapter which goes into much more detail about these books. And central to that chapter is the idea of Selena and Birdie as destabilizing forces. Black feminist in Washington claims that Selena is caught up in a paradox whereby, she must disrupt the destructive cycle of the community's boundaries, the expectations, and at the same time she must preserve its power of rugged endurance in a hostile white world. She remains on the edge, a marginal woman reaching for a life not bound by their comfortable, grim illusions. While I agree that Selena is a disruptor, I would argue that she is neither a woman nor marginal. She's not yet a woman, is what I mean. Indeed, when we begin to account for the position of childhood in the text, we learn over and over how she is both Dayton and Scylla's Selena. She's the product of both of these parents in terms of their temperaments and their outlook. And I argue that her destabilizing force follows the pattern of childhood. It's a little bit circular, but follows the pattern of childhood set by her parents. Selena speaks truth to power, as does her mother, and frequently Selena speaks truth to power to her mother. So I talked about these young women, Birdie and Selena, taking their girlhoods with them into adulthood, and I just want to, I think I'm pretty much out of time, so I just want to finish with what I meant by that very, very quickly. In Caucasia, the closing image of the novel, and this is not giving anything away, is so 400 pages, or 200 pages after the scene in the supermarket that I described to you. The closing image is of another mixed race Black girl, this time in California, anonymous, on a bus, on a forward moving bus. And I think for me, the symbolism of that bus, since we've already had a bus, we've already had a mixed race Black girl on the bus, is the ongoingness of Black girlhood, right? That this is not bounded in this novel. In Brown Girl, Brownstones, the closing image of that novel is of Selena taking this icon of her childhood. So the text tells us that every Barbadian girl is given 2 silver bangles when they're born, and they wear them for their whole lives. And the closing image of Brown Girl, Brownstones is of Selena throwing one of these bangles off into the atmosphere, but keeping one of them. And for me, again, that symbolism is very much about the retaining her girlhood. So I could obviously talk a lot longer, and I even have more text, but I'm just going to finish with 2 sentences and then turn it over to you guys for some questions. By reading these 2 novels through the lens of Black girlhood, girls are seen to shift the terms of the identity that the world wishes to impose upon them. Both authors show the working out of the unsolvable equations of predetermined identities, and they use the particular Black girls' lives to do so. In the process, these texts critique systems of racialization and gender and class. Within these texts, the historical or the stasis and of the various historical backgrounds contrasts with the development of the protagonists, and also offers a different way of looking at childhood. For me, there is not a consistent linear forward development in these texts, certainly not the type that we might look to in texts like Their Eyes Were Watching God or Maud Martha. The centering of Black girlhood in social and historical discourses of conflict and US identity is, in my opinion, a radical act, and also offers a key motivation for reading these 2 texts together, because it helps to establish a pattern and reject notions of singularity and how these powerful Black girls attempt to disrupt the hegemonic power of whiteness. So thank you. I'm going to end there. And that means I'm coming out of my PowerPoints.
Thank you so much, Nicole.
Give me a second.
Okay. And the other thing is, you know, like, this is the first research seminar we've done on teams, and, you know, this is such a weird, brave new world that we're living in. So we really, really appreciate you taking the leap with us and being our first. So thank you for that. And also thank you to everyone who was observing teams etiquette, and I think we got through that pretty well. So that's excellent. I'm going to ask, just for now, those mics to be muted again, just because there's an awful lot of feedback if not. And if you do have a question, as I said before, the ribbon is there for you to click on the conversation icon, which is a little speech bubble. If you want to put a question in there, I'd be happy to read it out. Alternatively, if you are a member of the Maynooth English crowd, you can put your little hand up, and you do have that privilege for our English research seminar. But Nicole, I just wanted to kind of start off with a kind of broad question, really, thinking about these very big, very weighty issues of childhood and Black childhood, and thinking about the ways in which we, you know, as a society, almost a global society, but certainly in the US, tend to kind of assume that Black people have an adulthood way beyond their years. And this has, you know, obviously had very devastating consequences. You think about the shooting of Tamir Rice, for example, who was, you know, 12 years old and playing with a toy gun and gets shot by a white policeman. And again, that kind of adultization of young Black kids is a real issue in the US. So, like, I guess thinking more broadly about your project, and in the context of our contemporary efforts to combat racism, how do you think your focus, or our focus, on Black childhood in literature can help us to to combat these issues, these problems, to help us engage with anti-racist work?
I think it's critical that we do in our literary work the type of work we want to see happening in the world, and I do think it's a radical act to begin to engage with and interrogate and map Black childhood in literature, and there's a lot of amazing scholarship. I was trying to curate my background, but I couldn't quite figure out how to do it, so I'm just getting up to get a book. But Nazira Sadiq Wright has written an amazing book on this is what I wanted my background to look like with all of these books. Yeah, that'll be my next Teams meeting. But this is just amazing, and I rely on this very heavily in my introduction. So Black girlhood in the 19th century, there's all sorts of things, all sorts of research in the works on this topic. But I think I do think that to devote time and energy as literary scholars, as students, as readers, to seeing and interpreting Black childhood in its complexity is anti-racist work, and trains us to think that through in our everyday lives. And you use this word adultification, which I don't know how many of the audience would be familiar with that, but it is the police officer who, or the neighborhood watch person, as with Trayvon Martin, who is threatened by a child because they don't see a child, right? They either see Blackness as a singular threat, or they see the Black child. If you put a Black child next to a white child, they would say, oh, white child is a child, the Black child is 5 years older. And so there are political scientists and sociologists doing this sort of work, and the same thing happens with Black girls. They are, and this is not a 21st century phenomena. I mentioned Harriet Jacobs in my sort of opening paragraph, and this idea of prematurely knowing is a way in which girlhood and innocence is robbed from Black girls. But you can hear me getting on my soapbox. I'm just going to leave it there with that question in case there are other questions. And I do a show and tell with my other books.
Thank you. Yeah, and feel free to get on the soapbox if you need to. You're in good company. Yeah, it reminds me of the Rankin quote from Citizen, because white men can't police their imaginations, Black men are dying. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Then, also sort of revisiting the books, especially Caucasia, and teaching these texts like Passing and others that you mentioned, Invisible Man, for example, though I don't think you did mention that, but it's another one that kind of often gets talked about.
I'm writing about that.
Yeah. Right. Brings me to think about Du Bois's definition of, very, very famous definition of kind of double consciousness, right? And I always kind of pull out certain terms from that famous quotation where he says, 2 souls, 2 unreconciled strivings. But he also writes 2 warring ideals within one dark body, and I kind of encourage students as well to pick up on the kind of violence and like real struggle in this definition. But of course, he then goes on to talk about manhood and self-conscious manhood, and I wonder if you could think about how, or if you do consider how Du Bois's double consciousness has kind of shaped these books, or can be almost turned on its head in a gender way, at least in the books that you're discussing.
Well, I would not be the first to look at double consciousness in Caucasia and in Brown Girl, Brownstones. So I think that is an entirely valid and fruitful line of investigation. But at the very basic level, it just works in terms of how Birdie and Selena are attuned. They are very finely attuned to how the world sees them, and what the world sees them as, and what's expected of them, and they resist that. But at the same time, and this is what's really, certainly some of my students sometimes I have to push them a little bit further so that they see this part of the idea of double consciousness, that awareness of how they are seen, is a really, as frustrating, as debilitating as it is absolutely essential for survival in a society which privileges whiteness, and which weaponizes whiteness, to understand how they are seen as raced and gendered. You know, I don't want to get into a sort of a spitting contest on levels that the sexual dangers that Black girls would also be subject to. It makes it absolutely essential that they understand. And I think that there's a lot in this sort of, I guess it's been the last couple of years, there's been a wider understanding of the talk that Black parents often have, especially in the United States, a talk that they have with their children, which is about police brutality and how, when the children are not with their parents, how they're supposed to react in order to preserve their lives when they are stopped by the police. And I think that talk for girls also includes ways of protecting themselves from sexual assault. So that's a long, I didn't circle back to double consciousness, but that idea of how they are seen is by others, as much as they might rail against that and understand how unfair that is, how limiting that is. It is also very, very important in terms of survival.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Yeah, I mean, I would encourage anyone else to, if you have a question, then please you can raise your hand, or you can put your question in the comment box. But I was just wondering, just a couple more questions if no one's going to come in straight away, although Conrad is there.
I think Conrad.
Yeah,
Conrad has a question.
Let's hear from Conrad. Conrad.
Hi. One thing is my chat thing isn't working.
Oh,
I'm not able to put comments, and maybe other people aren't as well. I'd just like to thank you for a wonderful talk, by the way. You know, it made me want to revisit the texts. And one thing I was thinking about in respect of Brown Girl Brownstones, there's this ongoing adult debate in the novel about, obviously, the extent to which the Barbadian community should think of themselves as distinct, or whether part of a larger African American community. And it's not an easy argument. It's not a straightforward one, because there are problems with asserting that kind of distinctiveness in terms of, you know, divide and rule and barriers to intersectionality. And it's, you know, it's tricky adult stuff. And I was wondering if perhaps from what you're saying, there's something about a girlhood perspective, as it were, a not yet formed perspective, a still growing perspective that enables this really knotty politics to actually survive in its complexity. I was wondering if you wanted to say a bit more about that.
I like that formulation of the knotty politics being able to survive in their complexity, because I do think that's where we are by the end of the text. Selena, unlike her mother, so her mother is very single-minded about just having lots of tenants in their brownstone so that she can accumulate the capital to buy outright a brownstone of her own. But so she's just focused. But Selena actually makes friends with the tenants, makes friends with African American women, and these women. There's a Barbadian woman who's a tenant, a former white maid from the previous wealthy white inhabitants of this brownstone, and there's the black hairdresser, who all function as types of guides for Selena. So through Selena, we see a possibility. So Shuggy Skeet, who's one of the tenants, who's a sort of very happy-go-lucky, sexually promiscuous, and doesn't care, who knows. She's from Barbados, and her vision of Barbados aligns more with the father's and is very much not about moving on up the social and economic ladder as the mother and the mother's peers and friends are. And so within Selena, we have that survival of that complexity. So I really like that formulation, because at the end of the text, we don't know where she's going. There's the implication that she's going to go to the Caribbean, but we don't know exactly where. And indeed, Paule Marshall, this is her first text, and I really encourage people to read some of her other books, uses that tension that Conrad's just identified between, and that tension between immigrant Black communities and more long-standing African American communities or Black American communities. But that is a dilemma and a tension that Marshall returns to over and over again. And in some texts, like Praise Song for the Widow, she resolves that tension through a connection of both the Caribbean and US Black cultures back to West Africa. So Marshall identifies West Africa as a way of connecting these divergent and differently treated, it must be said, differently treated. That's one of the tensions in brown girl, brown stones, Black communities. Thank you for that one.
Yes, I mean, in Praise Song for the Widow, there's this really rather comic sense, for most of the way through. Am I coming home or am I a tourist? Which way am I traveling? Am I coming to home or am I coming from a home? It's there's this constant. So it's like an alternating current of identification.
Absolutely.
It's very nicely put, Conrad. Always trying to come up with a doozy of a question. Moina. We have Moina Sullivan.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you. I just want to say as well, thank you very much, Nicole, for an incredibly rich and really absolutely fascinating paper. And I'm not familiar with the text, but you have absolutely encouraged me to go and read them. So my question then is one which may or may not have resonance for you. And it's got to do with the fact that we could say, I think quite unequivocally, that, within the history of literature and literary patterning and the white patriarchal canon, that we are as readers, or until recently enough, we have been really entrained to see the narrative pattern of the hero's journey, the boy's journey into manhood, as the template for humanity, and particularly the white boy's journey into manhood. And I'm wondering about the narrative patterning here and the journey, does it follow that kind of narrative? Do these texts follow the pattern of the hero's journey, or do they do something else which allow us to take other pathways? And I'm hoping that question makes sense in the context of not having read the text.
Yes, no, that's true. No, it's a good question. I mean, there's a way in which it fits. I cut a little bit of my talk. It's always so difficult. I have this sort of very big ranging chapter and trying to make it comprehensible in a much shorter space of word count is hard. But it is important to think about how these texts, these two novels, do fit into a sort of hero's journey, Bildungsroman, novel of development, and how they don't. So sort of most obviously in terms of sort of the female Bildungsroman. As we move through these novels, Birdie and Selena go from prepubescent, 8, 9, 10 years old, begin to menstruate, begin to have encounters, begin to understand themselves sexually and question themselves sexually, and move into womanhood. Selena more than Birdie, because we see her until she's 20. Alongside that sort of physical development of girls' bodies into women's bodies, that's initiated in these texts. There are literal journeys that they go on. For Selena in the 1959 text, it's this sort of, I suppose there's a genre that we haven't yet, or I haven't yet discovered, of New York texts, but a trope in that genre would be the way in which, you know, you go from the outer boroughs to Manhattan, you sort of discover the big city, or even moving down from Harlem into Midtown. Baldwin talks about that a lot, you know, that the city just was a very different place. And that's what that journey into a much more cosmopolitan, less sort of claustrophobic Barbadian immigrant community, and so exposure to a wider world of ideas happens through that particular type of journey, and invigorates her critical stance on the values that her mother is trying to instill in her. So yes, it does conform to that sort of hero's journey, but I think there are limits to that. Which is why I think I don't want to necessarily primarily engage with these texts as Bildungsroman. For Birdie and in Caucasia, what's so interesting is that it's, you know, it announces we're going on a journey, we're going underground, we can't stay in one place too long, and you kind of think, oh my God, this is sort of going to be like, you know, Huck Finn lighting out for the territory, and we're going to get this sort of American landscape. They start out in Boston and they end up in New Hampshire, and they've just basically gone to upstate New York, which might as well be New England and they don't go far at all. They don't go far at all. And it's very, what's the word? Not circular, not incestuous, but limited. I guess that's the word I'm looking for. And that I find very interesting in the sense of Birdie's journey is a journey back to herself, back to her sister. So it is not the discovery of something new. It is a retracing, not a retracing, but a return. So I think Caucasia maybe fits that Bildungsroman a little bit less easily, I would say. But thank you for the question.
Thank you, and thank you for your answer.
Thank you.
So yeah, so Conrad said that the chat function isn't working for all, so I think we have maybe time for just one squeak more question. Squeak one in, but if not, I think. Oh, yes. Shawita Nanda?
Yeah. Hello, ma'am. Dr. King, thank you so much. It was a great talk, enlightening talk, and thank you for giving me the opportunity. I just want to ask one general sort of a question. Going back to your original thesis, why do you think that Black children are neglected, even when we look at these central characters? But you're right, we don't talk about them in terms of Black girlhood. So going back to, say, Harriet Jacobs' narrative, so the title mentions girlhood, but when you look at the critical scholarship coming up, they don't talk about her experiences as being that of an enslaved girl child. They talk about her as an enslaved person. So, and the second part of my question is, mentioning again Toni Morrison, you referred to her. So she starts with the Black girl child and she ends in a way with God help the child. So I'm just looking at, but her stance on Black girlhood certainly develops it takes on a very different trajectory. I mean, the girl that we meet in 1917, Piccola, is somebody who doesn't survive. But Bright, the last text, you know, God help the child. She's a survivor. So the narrative certainly has changed from 1970s to the 2000s. You know, I mean, I can see the change in the narrative, but I'm still unable to fathom as to why don't we see that critical scholarship on Black girlhood till date. I mean, there are few texts. but Black womanhood takes a center stage somehow. So could you please respond to that? I'd love to hear your views. Thank you so much, ma'am. It was wonderful.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you like the talk, and that is a great question, just a great question. So I'm just going to try to take it bit by bit. Audre Lorde has a wonderful phrase which says, "Poetry is not a luxury," and I would co-opt that into. At the end of this talk, one of the things I want you to think about is how childhood should not be a luxury for any child in our contemporary culture. But it is, and it remains a luxury. Some children are allowed to be children, and some children are not seen as children, or not seen as occupying that space. So I think, why has there not been a sort of as much critical work on the notion of the Black child as there has been on, for instance, Black womanhood? I think it has been, part of it is the didactic imperative of African American literature. If we see its beginnings most firmly as evolving from the slave narratives. The slave narratives are about survival. And when the scholarship on Harriet Jacobs points very specifically to her determination to rescue her children, and her determination to claim that power to protect her children in a way in which, within systems of slavery in the US, you had very little power as a parent over the protection of your children. Obviously, your children could be sold away from you. Your children were capital in the same way that you were capital. So I think if we understand the literary tradition as both a creative and a political act, and I'm not making that up, that's a bastardized quotation from John Edgar Wideman, the amazing John Edgar Wideman, this dual imperative. I think the scholarship, to a certain extent, has followed suit, right? So to think about the way in which the Black family, Black women, queer Black men, queer people in general, have not been allowed to exist, have not been allowed to have full-fledged lives. That's where there's just been a lot of work needed. And that is also the critic following the trajectory of the text. But a big thing, a big sell for my book proposal when I was convincing Edinburgh University Press that they wanted to publish this book, was that children have always been there, right? The children are there in these texts, and these complex childhoods are there. So now, circling back to your really interesting comment about Toni Morrison, if you look at The Bluest Eye, and I think Paule Breedlove is one of, along with Bigger Thomas, one of the most famous Black children in American literature. We also have Claudia McTeer in The Bluest Eye, right? And it's her narrative perspective. And Claudia is a badass. And I'm not claiming this for myself, but Robin Bernstein, who, this is my other show and tell book. So just in her interest, so this is Racial Innocence, Performing American Childhood from Slavery to Civil Rights. Claudia is given, The Bluest Eye. Paule Breedlove wants blue eyes because then the world will love her the way they love Shirley Temple. Claudia, family takes Paule in, is given a white doll, and she knows she's supposed to love this doll. So again, this is not my reading, this is Robin Bernstein's reading. She picks that doll apart. She literally destroys the doll. She literally refuses to love that doll. And I think that sort of assertive Black girlhood is there in the bluest eye in 1970, but we have focused on the sort of pathologization of Pacola, and not necessarily looked at the agency and the power and the opinion that comes from Claudia McTeer. So I think it's all there for the picking. We've got lots and lots and lots of work to do, and many amazing texts. And I'm glad nobody's asked me about media or the 21st century text, because I'm not as well versed, but I did have in my notes, just in case anybody asks, I'm looking forward to viewing Rocks, which is British Girlhood, and that's just come out as a Film 4 production. And of course, some of you might have seen the controversy about Cuties, which is on Netflix, which I think is French, but I haven't seen it yet. But these are very, I think, that's a really great question. But it is about the reason we haven't done this is because there's just been so much other work to do in terms of the themes and the relationships presented in the literature as a way of combating the general social and cultural representation of Black people.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you for that excellent final question. I think we can all unmute to applaud Nicole one more time and say thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and Bill. It's great to see you. Yeah, put on your camera. Lovely, lovely. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I really appreciate it.
So do we. Thank you. Okay, that concludes our research seminar. To leave the seminar, to leave the Teams meeting, there is a red end call button at the end of your ribbon on your screen. So if you press that, you will leave the meeting.
Thank you very much. Bye.
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 Professor King. Thank you.
Bye.